The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed on the Nova Society are those of our guests and panel members and do not represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of any institution any member of the Nova Society is associated with. The material information presented on the Nova Society is for general information purposes only. Reproduction or dissemination for the purpose other than education is prohibited without express written consent of the Nova Society. We'd like to welcome everyone back to the Nova Society, and today we again answer another listener email who is asking us about the recent collapse of the Israeli War Cabinet. What might this mean for the conflict between Israel and Hamas? Is this something that might be a positive, or is it possibly a negative? Also, what might this mean for the upcoming address by the Israeli Prime Minister to the joint session of Congress here in the United States? So let's listen in.
Paul from California. Israel's war cabinet has been dissolved, and what might be the consequences? Or Israel's war cabinet has dissolved, not been. There's no been in there.
Yeah, I mean, I understand what the question is about. It's a little hard to tell. Today is June 21st. Netanyahu is coming to speak to Congress on June 24th, I believe. And I think we'll know more then than we do now. Obviously, the first part of this is that Netanyahu has to back down the right wing of his coalition. How skillfully he manages to do that, I'm not really sure. But by Benny Gantz leaving sort of as the moderate voice, you would think that the immoderate voices have a louder voice now. And Netanyahu, I think, for his own safety and career, such as it is left, is going to want to mitigate that loud voice somewhat.
But do you think that was a mistake for the larger picture of what's going on overall?
Well, the first thing to remember is that the war cabinet really was advisory. It wasn't a part of like the true government of Israel. It's not like, the parliament or anything else. It was really more advisory, to be able to get people on different sides of the issue, get their voices heard. The decisions still come from the prime minister. You can always take advice, but it doesn't mean you have to follow it. I agree with Scott that a lot's going to be determined by what is said when he addresses the joint session of Congress. I also think it's very interesting the number of people this time around who are not going to be attending. Some very high, powerful senators and some Congress people that are simply not going to attend. I also found it interesting that there was actually a planned meeting between Netanyahu and the president, and now that's been canceled. I don't know. Benny Gantz leaving, was it a mistake? He's a politician as well. If you're in a war cabinet and you're giving your advice and you're giving your suggestions, and those suggestions are ignored, you're still in the war cabinet. So you can be associated with the decisions that are being made, perceived being made by the war cabinet, but are really being made by the prime minister. I think what's more interesting to see in this scenario is what the military does. The Israeli military is a little different than, say, the United States' military. The Israeli military is all about Israel. That's what they're all about. They're not, beholden to the president. They're not beholden to any office, so to speak, like, the commander in chief, even though, again, the prime minister has powers with the military. But I think you're going to see that how the military reacts to this, I think is going to be extremely important to really keep an eye on what those senior military leaders say, because they've been a little bit divided, and they have had a voice. They've actually had a voice a lot more than you would expect from, say, the Joint Chiefs. We always hear about the Joint Chiefs here in the United States, but we know where this position is, but they always take the party line. The president says this is what we're going to be. That's the party line. We are controlled by a civilian, we have to follow that party line. And I don't think that in Israel that is as much the case. And so really keeping an eye on what the Israeli military says as it relates to this. But Benny Gates leaving, I don't see that as I don't think it's a mistake. I think it was just basically, I choose not to play anymore. That's my thought on that.
Yeah, and trying to force change by leaving the war cabinet. Benny Gantz is trying to force an election. He's trying to make a change here, and I think it was a good move. I think that the right wing in Israel is not a fan of peace, and I can't get behind them for that. And I don't think that most Israelis do. And we've actually seen nightly demonstrations with thousands of people marching in the streets every night in Tel Aviv and other cities, trying to bring back the hostages. It has to be the number one goal right now. Netanyahu mentions it as the number two goal after destroying Hamas. Well, the military is saying you can't destroy Hamas. Hamas has gotten stronger since we've started this, not weaker, and you're not going to destroy Hamas militarily. So what we need to do here is find a peaceful solution to this issue, and the right wing is not helping. Just an hour or so ago, the finance minister Smotrich in Israel said that what he has tried to do since he joined the government in 2022 is place a lot of the military duties in the West Bank under civilian control, because the army in the West Bank has sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes destroyed settler encampments that are built without government permission, stopped Israeli activists from entering the West Bank. And the right wing wants to give greater civilian control over the West Bank, strip the army's ability to block settlements, and just work towards civilian control of the West Bank that has always, according to the courts, been a military occupation based on security needs, not since 1967 a place to live. And if that changes, I think that would be very, very bad for Israel. I think Donald Trump, by the way, would support it wholeheartedly without understanding the ramifications of it at all, and that it's really important to get the hostages back first, end this war, and move on with the business of trying to create a solution through diplomacy and international support that creates a situation of peace in the Middle East.
You think it's possible to do it this way if Trump is not elected?
It's going to be bloody, because on both sides there are fanatics who will stoop to any measure to prevent it, which is what 10/7 is all about, right? Which is what Hamas's attack on Israel was all about, was preventing a peaceful two-state solution from happening, because it was getting a little close to this deal that they were making between Saudi Arabia and Israel, which threatens Iran and threatens Hamas and threatens Hezbollah. And people, need to see that for what it is. But once you understand that that was the goal, defeating it shouldn't be that difficult, although it will not be peaceful. I mean, peace is not going to be peaceful in the Middle East, in Israel, in Gaza, and the West Bank. There's going to be blood. There are going to be explosions. There are going to be attack. There's going to be terrorism. It's not going to be easy pulling 500,000 Israeli civilians out of the West Bank, but they have to do that. It's going to be tumultuous, but it has to happen.
It's also important to remember that whenever we think of the military, a lot of people in the United States, when they think of the military, they think of like George Patton, who absolutely enjoyed the idea of war, who after World War II thought we should go after Russia while they were down. That's not what the modern military is like. Today, yes. Are they soldiers? Yes. Are they very good at warfare? Yes, they are. But in many ways, they also look for ways to prevent war. They understand the horrors of war. And the really great military leaders that exist today, and there's some in Israel, some in the United States, some all the way around the world, understand the horrors of war. And they can be some of the greatest peacemakers. And I totally agree with Scott. You know, the military in Israel has told the politicians, this is not as easy as you seem to think it is, especially with, you know, one hand tied behind our back. This is just not going to go the way you want it to go. And I think that that's, again, like I said before, what the military says and the direction that the military gives the Israeli government, I think is an important thing to really keep an eye on, because of all the actors in Israel that are truly concerned and understand the situation, it is the military that understands it. It is those generals that are sending those young people into war. You know, the politicians kind of do it by proxy through the generals. And the fact is that they don't want to send anybody in. I mean, they don't, and they understand the difficulty that this situation, this conflict presents them. And having that understanding without looking at it from the idea of politics. Because no matter what, politicians still going to look at everything. You know, it's like the old thing. If you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. That's politicians. Everything revolves around politics. The military in Israel and in the United States, and, you know, so as I say, across the world, they look at it from the perspective that they're the ones that have to actually, they're the doers. They're the worker bees. They're the ones that have to send these people into harm's way. And I don't know very many generals beyond Patton who relished in that.
Yeah. I've heard that Patton once looked at a hill in Sicily and said, I would give 10,000 men for that hill. And that was the kind of mindset that he had. The problem that Netanyahu faces right now, and that he has to sort of get his mind around a little bit and convince the country, is that they had at the very beginning of this a limited amount of time that they, as we said it would be 2 weeks. It would turn out to be 2 days with world approval. But even without world approval, they fought this war with one hand tied behind their back because they can blow up any building that they want. And instead, they're trying to go in as much as possible and prevent civilian casualties, which is obviously, if we're to trust the numbers, and I suppose we have to, 35,000 Gazan civilians dead, including men, women, and children, and so on and so forth, and that they have not destroyed more than, let's say, 20% of the underground tunnel network, so that they have not managed that they're falling into the same kind of war that they're fighting in Ukraine, which is a war of attrition, grinding out inch by inch, having to go back over things that they've already cleared, and they have to go back again. And it should surprise nobody, because look, Hamas still has probably like 15 to 20,000 fighters still. That's 10 times or more the amount that they needed to carry out the October 7th attacks. It's not going to end militarily. This is going to end when the hostages are released and Israel agrees to a permanent ceasefire. The first thing that Netanyahu has to do is get those hostages home.
And, you know, Scott brings up a very good point when he talks about it really depends on what the population of Israel thinks on this. It does matter. And let's remember, Israel is not like the United States. Yes, we have a military and we have families that have members of the military. In Israel, there's mandatory service. They also have a smaller population, quite a bit smaller population. I would say that it is reasonable to assume that 80% of the families in Israel have someone serving. They have skin in the game. You know, it's easy for us here in the United States to say, well, you know, we don't want our boys and our men and women killed, but we probably don't have a member in service. Now, there are people that do have that. But in Israel, it's almost universal. They have people that are serving. So they're putting their family in harm's way. And I understand they're willing to do that for their country. I got all that. But it takes on a different dynamic when you know that the policies being created by the politicians for political reasons are in fact going to put your child, your family member, in harm's way in some form. And I think that really is the difference that we have to look at. Israel has what, 10 million? About 10 million,
something like that.
About 10 million. And again, it's mandatory service. So and it's not just, men, it's men and women, young men and women. So a majority of those 10 million, or say 5 million families, if you want to, I would say they probably have someone in service that is a relation. And that creates a huge different dynamic. When they say thank you for your service in Israel, they're talking to their family members. Unlike a lot of people here in the United States who did not have family members in military.
Yeah, the military here is the other 1%, right?
That's correct. That's exactly right. So, we have to look at this and we have to say that dynamic really has to weigh upon the government. That's a political consideration. But it's also a consideration of those generals and those colonels and those majors, because guaranteed they probably also have their children serving in the military. They're sending their own into these dangerous situations. And that's just, it creates, as I say, a different dynamic than what we have here in the United States.
Any final thoughts?
I just want to caveat something that I said, that fighting with one hand behind your back doesn't mean that I'm neglecting the idea that Israel has dropped a lot of bombs in Gaza. I understand that they've dropped probably, I think at this point, more bombs than were dropped in London, Hamburg, and Dresden during World War II combined. So I don't want to say that. I don't want to downplay that. There's been a lot of bomb dropping, but nonetheless, they could level the whole place if they wanted to, and they haven't.
It could be worse.
If the gloves were off and both hands were available, what would that look like?
It would be really horrible. It would be almost too horrible to contemplate. 60% of Palestinians in Gaza already have a family member killed. 3/4 of the population has said that they've got people who are either moving, displaced or wounded in some way or another. It would be worse than that, and that is almost too horrible to contemplate.
Wow. I don't even want to think about nuclear.
So that's all the time we have for today's episode. The Nova Society is a production of the Phoenix Research Institute. We'd like to thank our sponsors for this episode. BH Conflict Resolution Services, a full-service dispute resolution firm offering expert and cost-effective mediation services to couples, groups, and businesses. BHCRS can be reached at www.bhcrs.com. We'd also like to thank our podcast partners, Buzzsprout, who hosts the Nova Society, Audacity, our editing partners, and Podkite, who does all of our analytics. iHeartRadio, where people get their music and podcasts, Apple iTunes, the largest source for music and podcasts on the internet, Spotify, the most popular source for the Nova Society. The Nova Society is available on all of these and other quality platforms. We'd like to thank all of our listeners. Without you, the Nova Society would not be possible. If you have a comment, question, or would like to be a guest on the Nova Society, we can be reached at nova.society.podcast@gmail.com. Always remember, the power of society is knowledge. So for Dr. Scott Gershworth, Dr. Priscilla Hobbs, Dr. Brooklyn Ann Weldon, and all of us here at the Nova Society, I'm Dr. Mark Bound. Be well, and we hope to see you again next time.